So there's a video that's been circling around the internet this weekend. I saw it on Facebook about a motorcycle gang called the Patriot Guard. Have any of you heard of them? Yeah. The Guard's primary purpose for being is to be a presence at military funerals, forming a barrier between the family of the deceased and anyone there protesting the funeral. So you may be wondering, why would somebody protest a military funeral? Most of these protesters are from the Westboro Baptist Church. It's a very small church and has a very particular agenda. They believe that events such as 9/11 and the war in Iraq are God's ways of punishing the U.S. for homosexuality in our country. I don't quite understand the logic of it. Most people don't, and they're pretty out there with their protests, which are inflammatory and hateful, and really just not in line with the gospel. So the Patriot Guard does this great service by forming a visual and sound barrier against these hateful rants by this church, so the military families can bury their loved ones in peace. In the video, there was an interview with one of the leaders of the Patriot Guard, and he's a motorcyclist, and I mean like Harley with a leather vest and all that. So he's a motorcyclist, a veteran, and a Methodist minister. And he spoke about how important it is for faith not to exist in an isolated world, only in the church building or only in our prayer life, but for faith to take action in the world and to make a difference. Now, I would add to that more than just taking action, which we could say the Westboro Baptist Church is doing. They're taking action according to their faith. I would say that it's about faith in loving action, which is what the good news of Jesus is about. So we get a sense of what this means, faith in loving action, in today's gospel. It's about Christian community, how we live together, love each other, and continue to move forward, knowing that we're human and we have conflicts and struggles. This gospel is interesting for lots of reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that it helps us get an idea of the nature of gospel texts, how they were written and why, which is quite different than the way we write today. So, for example, as I told you about this video I saw, I made sure that I told the story accurately and that I quoted the leader of the Patriot Guard as well as I could and factually, right? This is important to us when we hear a story, to know that the facts are all there as best they can be. When the Gospels were written, well after Jesus' life and death and resurrection, the relaying of actual facts was not so important. Rather, the telling of the story and conveying the meaning was what was important. The Gospels are about sharing the good news of Jesus in a way that the time and place in which they were written, the people could understand. So, in our gospel, Jesus is teaching us about how to handle conflict in the church, but the church did not exist during Jesus' lifetime. He would not have spoken about the church. Church was something that happened later on and was in large part the occasion for writing the Gospels, so that the church would know the story. Now, Matthew is taking some liberties here that in our day we would consider inaccurate, and in some cases outrageous. I mean, can't you get sued for putting words in someone else's mouth that they didn't say? But that was the sort of tradition of that culture. This was not unusual to be done during that time. So this passage from Matthew also says something that is really out of character with who we know Jesus to be. Matthew writes of excommunication. Let such a one be to you as a Gentile and tax collector. And what do we know about how Jesus treated Gentiles and tax collectors? Were they excommunicated? No, he worked really hard to bring them into community and to love them. He did not use them as the bad example that we just heard in Matthew's gospel. So, you see, not everything in the Bible fits together perfectly or makes perfect sense. The way Jesus speaks of the Gentile and tax collector does not make sense with the Jesus we know, who extends the welcome to the least of these, the poor, the sinner, the hated, the abused. Now, Matthew was doing his best to communicate something, to convey meaning that probably had some relationship to the teaching of Jesus as had been passed down. But he did not do so in a way that fit with who we know Jesus to be. He left out that part about faith in loving action when he used the Gentile and tax collector as his bad example. So as we read the Bible and pray with these sacred texts, it is important that we use our minds, what we know from the Bible as a whole, and our hearts, how we understand God and the love of God in our lives, to consider and hold on to the essential message. And the essential message of Jesus is all about a loving God, about fullness of life and a mutuality of love and care for all of God's creation, not just the people who are in the right group or behave the right ways. Now, the end of the gospel text, we get a little bit more of a clue about this idea of faith and loving action. Jesus tells us that what we bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what we release on earth will be released in heaven. And those are powerful words, and I'm not sure that we really understand what that means. But I think Jesus is probably speaking about forgiveness, about what happens inside of us when we harbor anger and hatred and rage, and don't allow our hearts to be open to the healing love of God. Certainly, the importance of an open heart, of being able to hear one another, working together in relationship to resolve a conflict, is a big part of today's gospel. But Matthew, in this last part, goes a little bit beyond that. Lets us know that when we hold on to something, when we harbor that fear and hatred, there are consequences. And when we let go of something, there are consequences. So we have this idea of letting go and unbinding that which has been bound. And we have the idea of faith and loving action. And in our lives, we have the 10th anniversary of 9/11 coming up. So I would like you to join me in thinking about what we need to let go of now. And what do we need to hang on to as we approach this anniversary of 9/11? What does it look like to be acting lovingly in faith? The thing about the Patriot Guard that is so great is that they have a very clear mission. We need a clear mission as well. We are not a gang of motorcyclists or veterans. I mean, there are some of us out there, I know. But we are a group of Christians, as diverse as we are, who care a lot about the state that the world is in. What ways can our faith inspire us into loving action? You know, in our time of silence and reflection after the sermon, I want you to take some time to consider this question, not only for what you can do as individuals, but how we as Christ's body can take this idea of faith and loving action and be the peace and love of Christ in our world.